Welcome to the webinar. This is how to remember more of what you read. I'm Paul Nowak, the founder of Iris Reading. And if you've been to some of our other webinars, you know that we focus a lot on improving reading speed. In this webinar, I want to talk about how do we actually remember more of what we read. And this is really important because I think a lot of programs that are out there that call themselves speed reading programs do not focus enough attention on how do you remember material better. For example, a lot of times we're taught, or we're told in school, memorize this, but we're not really told here's how you memorize or here's how you remember things better. So I want to go over some simple ways to improve your memory. If you're doing a lot of reading, this is going to be very important for you. But let's think about times where um, our memory kind of falters. And I want you to know that your memory, when you don't remember what you read, that's not a comprehension issue, that's a retention issue. There's a difference between comprehension and retention. Comprehension is what you're understanding the moment you're actually reading it, whereas retention is what you remember later on. That might be a minute later, it could be an hour later, or a day later, or a whole year later. Think about the books that you read in high school. How many of those books do you actually still remember the details of? So let's talk about some situations where we easily forget things. For example, you ever forget someone's name? Why is it so easy to forget people's names? Well, sometimes we immediately forget someone's name as soon as they told us their name. For example, at the beginning of this webinar, I introduced myself. Some of you probably already forgot my name, and that's common. It happens often, but I want to discuss why this happens. Sometimes it happens because we're not paying attention to begin with. If you get introduced to somebody and they mention their name, sometimes you're thinking about what you're about to say to them and you don't catch the name to begin with because sometimes we're not paying attention. So step number one in any kind of um, memory exercise, if we're trying to remember anything, step number one is always trying to pay attention. So it's always important. How can we find ways to improve our ability to focus? For me, this is, turning off my cell phone while I'm reading. If I have to do some very technical reading for an extended period of time, I'll turn my phone off because I know that I get easily distracted. Phone calls come in, text messages come in. Or try to avoid, if you feel easily distracted by on the computer screen, you're reading, let's say, your textbook, you might want to move the computer away while you're doing your reading. So always make sure that you're paying attention and try to find ways that you can improve your focus. If you want to look into more depth on this topic of focus, we're not going to go into a lot of depth on it today, but you can check out a course we did on the topic of focus. That's on our website. But think about why names are easy to forget. Part of it has to do with the fact that names are abstract. Somebody tells you their name. For example, I tell you, my name's Paul. Nice to meet you. Um, a name like that is very abstract versus if I told you to imagine a basketball, you could easily picture it. Or if you see somebody's face, that's visual. Visual information is always easier to remember. And actually, it's interesting that you'll forget someone's name, but the interesting thing is that you'll remember their face. So if you were introduced to somebody yesterday and you forgot their name, the next day or a week later or maybe even a year later, you might still remember meeting them, but you'll forget their name. And part of it has to do with you see the face, you don't see the name. And because the information is abstract, it's easier to forget. So when we have abstract information, one of the key things that we need to do is turn that information into visual information. And this whole idea behind like names in abstract versus visual reminds me of this thing called the Baker-Baker paradox. And I want to discuss this because it's really important as to how you recall information. The Baker-Baker paradox is based on a study that they did where somebody is introduced to a person and the person tells them that their name is Mr. Baker. And they took another group of people and they told them not that the person's name was Mr. Baker, but that the person was a baker. That was that person's profession. That's what they did for a living. They baked. And the people, 90% of the people that were told this person's name is Mr. Baker, the next day, a lot of those people forgot the name. Whereas the other group of people that were introduced to this person that was a baker as part of his profession, 90% of them were able to remember the next day that that person was a baker. And why is that? Because when somebody is told this person is a baker, what do you start visualizing? You picture that person as a baker. What does the baker look like? Maybe a top hat. You're thinking, you know, maybe an apron of some sort. So we have a visual reference to a baker, and a lot more connections are made to our brain, within our brain, when we're told this person is a baker. But when you're told abstract information like this person's name is Mr. Baker, it's easier to forget. So always remember that you need to try to find ways to take abstract information and visualize it. So that includes when you're reading. If you're reading something, every so often it might not be you finish a paragraph, and if you can visualize in your head what's going on at that moment. And I know sometimes if you're dealing with technical or dry material, this is not always easy, but you need to almost force the visuals to go on in your head. And initially, when you do this, um, it's a little bit of a mental thought process that needs to go on. Eventually, with practice, it starts getting better. So try to visualize your information. And the best way to try to do this is finish reading a paragraph, stop for a quick moment, and see if you could visualize what you just read. And when I say visualize, think of things that are concrete. So if I was reading a textbook on marketing and they were talking about a certain kind of marketing technique or a marketing strategy, let's say it had to do with email marketing, you might finish and then you might visualize yourself for a moment doing that. Maybe, sitting in front of in front of a computer, typing out those emails if it was email marketing related. Or if you're reading something, let's say scientific material, you might have to visualize what's going on. And that's part of the reason why looking at diagrams is so important. A lot of people will read through and they don't spend a lot of time on diagrams. And diagrams help you tremendously to remember what you just read because they're visual. So always remember, visual information is going to be easier to remember than abstract information. So we need to take the abstract and try to make it visual. Now, let's think about other situations where actually our memory performs very well. You ever have a song stuck in your head? Or you ever have a song that comes on the radio, or maybe not the radio, but it comes on and you hear this song you haven't heard in years? How does it happen that it's so easy to remember songs? How do they get stuck in your head? Did you have to, you know, did you have to listen to that song over and over again to get it stuck in your head? Well, yes, initially, but did you have to listen to it once every month to keep it fresh? Not really. Some of these songs you hear and you haven't heard them in years, but you remember the lyrics of the song. And that's actually amazing. Think about why that happens. The main reason why you remember a song is because repetition helps you remember. I'll repeat that. Repetition helps you remember. And nobody remembers the lyrics of a song after hearing it just once. You need that repetition. I mean, unless it's one of those songs that has just the same lyrics being said all the time throughout it. But think about the repetition. You hear a song over and over again because maybe it was popular at the time and they played it on the radio, or maybe you had it on your iPod and you listened to it over and over again. So, and also think about all the repetition going on within a song. There's the beat that repeats, or the melody. There's the chorus, right, or the hook that repeats. So there's a lot of repetition. That's part of the reason why songs are so easy to remember. I know some people at this point will say, well, how come, it's so easy to remember songs, but it's so hard to remember my textbook chapter? Well, keep in mind, songs are typically 3 to 4 minutes. If you put all those lyrics on a printed page, you would only have a few pages. Your textbook chapter has about 30 or 40 pages, or sometimes 50 or more. There's a lot more information there, and it's naturally harder to remember all that information. But there are some ways that we can actually get repetition in to help us remember. And it doesn't mean you have to read a chapter 10 times in a row just to get the repetition in to remember it. One way to easily get repetition in is by taking notes. Note taking is actually a form of repetition. A lot of people forget that, and some people don't take enough notes, and of course sometimes people spend too much. I know some of you are probably in here wondering, well, I feel like I spend too much time taking notes. We'll talk about how to kind of strike a nice balance, but the main thing I want to emphasize here, if you need to really remember what you're about to read, you definitely want to take notes. Now, let's talk about and actually, by the way, this is based on some studies. You ever take notes and never look at them again? I think all of us have done this. I used to do this all the time in high school. I would take notes during class just to pass the time. I would just completely copy the blackboard. And teachers and professors have known for a while that students will take notes and sometimes never look at them again. And they wanted to know, if you take notes and never look at them again, is it a waste of time? Should you just not, what's the point if you're not going to look at them again? And what they find is that just the action of writing something down helps you remember it because it's a form of repetition. It takes some mental thought to write something down, and it's a form of repetition. So keep in mind, just writing something down will help you remember. Now, if you refer to it again later on, that will help you remember it even further. Now, when should you be taking notes? This is actually a very important distinction, especially since we teach speed reading courses. We don't want students reading for 15 minutes and spending a half an hour or more taking notes. We want to strike this balance where we're taking quick and effective notes. And when you should take notes, here's when you shouldn't take notes. Don't take notes after just one sentence. So, for example, you ever buy a used college textbook and you see a ridiculous amount of highlighting in it? How does excessive highlighting happen? The way it happens is someone's reading along, and let's say they're preparing for a test. They read a sentence and they're like, "Whoa, that's really important. I got to highlight that, or I got to write it down." So let's say they highlight the material, and then they read the next sentence, and it turns out they're like, "You know what? That's actually kind of important too. I'm going to highlight that as well." And then they read the next sentence after that, and it turns out this sentence is way more important than the previous two. So now they have to highlight this one as well, and maybe they'll use a different colored marker this time around. But you can already see where this is going. If you're taking notes after just reading one sentence, it reminds me of this common phrase. I'm sure you've heard it before. When you get caught up in the details, you lose sight of the big picture. So getting caught up in details with reading, I think this is one of the biggest problems with reading. People do get caught up in the details and they lose sight of what their chapter is really about or what the concept is really, how the concept's trying to be explained. If you're taking notes after just one sentence, that's getting caught up in the details. When should you take notes? You should at least wait until you finish a paragraph before taking some notes. And the way that you're going to take notes, you can highlight. Maybe you're going to be writing in the margin. Maybe you have a separate sheet of paper. But that kind of leads us to our next question. How should I take notes? Well, there's a number of ways that you can take notes. We talked about highlighting. That's one way. Some people underline. Some people take notes in the margin. Some people, I want to break it down into two general areas of note taking. One area, which we're all familiar with, is outlines. Outlines are linear based notes. We've all seen outlines. We've probably done them in the past. And outlines are fine when you have information that is sequential, where Roman numeral 2 should come after 1. For example, history is very sequential. World War II should probably come after World War I if you were taking notes. But there's a lot of topics that don't have to be in a certain order. And those topics are nonlinear and lend themselves better to a form of note taking called mind mapping. Mind mapping is a very effective way of taking notes for topics that are nonlinear. So let's take an example. We mentioned marketing earlier. Well, marketing, if it was an outline, what would be number one? Well, notice how that's kind of a hard question to answer. But if I asked you, what are the things involved in marketing, it would be very easy for you off the top of your head to think, okay, well, there's, like word of mouth marketing, and then there's also internet marketing, and related to internet marketing is maybe, the ads that you see on Google, ads you might find on Facebook. There's display advertising, there's pay-per-click advertising. That's all internet marketing. But then there's offline marketing, maybe flyer distribution. And so those kind of topics are very nonlinear. And you can actually organize those very nicely in the form of a mind map. And I mentioned marketing as one. I could give you a bunch of topics here that would lend themselves to mind mapping. You could take the topic of law. If you're studying law, well, you have constitutional law, there's labor law, there's contract law, there's intellectual property. You could do the same thing with physics. Physics doesn't lend itself to an outline format. Physics is a little more like a mind map where you have physics in the middle, and on these nodes over here would be something like, we could talk about Isaac Newton and laws of motion. We could talk about Einstein's theories of relativity. We could talk about quantum mechanics, string theory. There's all these things that are associated with the topic of physics. And this happens with a lot of different topics. Certain topics, like history, are much more outline based. Other topics, mind mapping based. So make sure that you're taking notes to reflect the type of material that you're studying. If you have anything that's sequential, do it as an outline. If you have anything that's not linear, you might want to do a mind map. And another thing about mind maps, there's a reason why they call them mind maps. It's because they reflect the way your mind works a lot more accurately than linear based notes. So keep that in mind. And by the way, if you're looking for some useful mind mapping applications. If you take a lot of your notes on the computer screen, here are two mind mapping applications that I would highly recommend. And I recommend them because I actually use them personally. Um, and I use these MindMeister. I use a little more for web-based notes because you can actually share your mind maps. If you want something that you can download and actually store on your computer, then you want Xmind. Now, by the way, Iris doesn't get any kind of we don't get any kind of financial incentives from MindMeister or Xmind for mentioning them. I'm actually mentioning these because I actually use them myself. And MindMeister is a great application. It's web-based. Xmind, it's downloadable. MindMeister used to have a free trial. I think they still have a free trial. We use it actually internally here at Iris for brainstorming, for project management, doing marketing campaigns. But if I was a student, I would definitely be using one of these applications to take all of my notes or most of my notes because mind mapping is a very effective way of doing so. So check out one of these if you're looking for a mind mapping application. There are hundreds of different mind mapping applications out there, believe it or not. I've tested out maybe 20 of them. These are my two favorite as of now. Now, why are we talking about note taking? Because repetition helps you remember. Well, what are some other ways we can get repetition in? I want to discuss a reading framework that is very much going to help you with repetition, and it's called the multiple reading process. It's a three-step reading process where you start with a preview, which is reading the introduction and the conclusion to whatever the material you have. For example, if you had an article, you might read the first and last paragraph. If you had a textbook, the intro and conclusion is very easy to find in a textbook chapter. Now, the first step is just getting a general idea. In this process, you start off and you read, let's say, the intro and the conclusion. The second step is reading the headings and the subheadings, looking for bold-faced words, reading the first sentences. Let's say you don't have any headings or subheadings. I would just read the first sentence of every paragraph. Why the first sentence? Because first sentences tend to be the main idea. It's not always the main idea, but most of the time it is. So reading the first sentence of a paragraph, if I had, let's say, an article that was a couple pages long, during the overview step, I would read the first sentence of every single paragraph, and that would give me a really good idea as to what that article is going to be about. So, and then the third step is simply reading, going through and getting your details. But notice in this process how we start with very general preview, then we get a little more detailed overview, and then we get even more detailed read. Let me explain how we would do this first on an article. So we start with a preview. I'm going to take a sample article here. I'm going to pull it up on my computer screen. Should be able to see it in a moment. Now, my apologies if you sat in on another webinar and I used the same article. I want to use this article just because it's a one-pager, and we can discuss how we can use this process very easily on this kind of material. Preview would be reading intro and conclusion. So I'd read my first paragraph, and I'd read my last paragraph. The overview step, that's step number 2. Remember it says read headings, subheadings, bold-faced words. Well, it turns out this article has 0 headings and subheadings, but it does have paragraphs. So instead, I'm going to read first sentences. I go over here and I'm just reading all the first sentences. So the economic transformation of India is one of the great business stories of our time. That's a main idea. Look at the first sentence over here. But India has run into a surprising hitch on its way to superpower status. Its inexhaustible supply of workers is becoming exhausted. Another main idea. Look at this one right here. How is this possible in a country that every year produces 2.5 million college graduates and 400,000 engineers? Another main idea. Look at this one right here. There was a time when many economists believed that post-secondary education didn't have much impact on economic growth. Another main point. We go over here. The irony of the current situation is that India was once considered to be overeducated. Another main point. I'll read these last two. Since the Second World War, the countries that have made successful leaps from developing to developed status have all poured money, public and private, into education. And the last one here says India has taken tentative steps to remedy its skills famine. The current government has made noises about doubling spending on education, and a host of new colleges and universities have sprung up since the mid-1990s. Now, I know I'm reading these out loud, but if you were doing this on your own, think about it. It doesn't take all that much time to read the first paragraph, the last paragraph, all the first sentences, and then by the time you get to this third step of reading, it's going to be very easy to read through this material, understand it well. Guess what's going to happen to your reading speed? You'll probably read a little faster. Actually, I would skip this first paragraph because I already read it, and I would just start reading from here and going through, and I would get through the whole article quickly because I know what to expect. What about my comprehension? It's going to be pretty high because I know what to expect. And think about your retention. Am I going to be able to remember this? Well, repetition is how you remember things. Look at all the repetition going on here. Preview, overview, read. That's 3 repetitions right there. If you need to know this information really, really well, then you could actually get more repetition by taking notes. Remember we said earlier that taking notes is a form of repetition. So the way I would do it is I would preview the material, take some notes. That would be a second repetition, taking notes. Then I would overview material. That would be a third repetition. Take some notes based on the overview. That's number 4. By the time we read the material, we've had 5 repetitions. And if we take some notes, that would be 6. Who's more likely to remember this article or any other material that you utilize this process? Someone that's read it once, beginning to end, or someone that's read it multiple times? And I know some people will argue that, well, when you're reading it like this, 3-step process, it might take you longer. Not necessarily. Keep in mind, the person that's starting with this step has to read slower. Why? Because they don't know what they're getting themselves into. For me, I'm going to read a lot faster when I get here because I know what to expect. I'm going to go a lot faster than I would normally read because I've already done these 2 steps here. Now, we talked about it on this article right here. This is a simple 1-page article, but what about more technical information? But material that has headings, subheadings, something like a textbook. I'm going to pull up a longer article here, and I know this is not extremely dense material, but I'm pulling it up because notice how it has headings and subheadings. You've got some bold-faced words over here, an ordered list. I want to discuss how we would go through this kind of material. And by the way, you can think of this, you can compare this to reading like a textbook because it has headings and subheadings like a lot of textbooks do. How would we do the preview on this article? The preview would be, again, we're starting with the preview. The preview is simply, all right, I'm going to read this title, obviously. I'm going to read this little quote at the beginning. And this right here looks like an introduction to me. So I'm going to read that. And now I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to go all the way to the end. And I'll read this last paragraph because I think that looks like a conclusion of some sort. Now, remember how we said earlier, the preview is simply reading the intro and the conclusion, however you can spot it. So although I'm saying here, read the first and last paragraph, in your own material, it might be a little different because if you're reading a textbook, the preview would be reading maybe the objectives that you have at the beginning or the case study at the beginning or anything, maybe a first few paragraphs, first 2 pages. And the conclusion could be, actually, it's usually very easy to find conclusions in textbooks because they simply say conclusion or summary. Or maybe you got to do the questions at the end of the chapter. Well, if you got to do the questions, then I would read all of those questions first before reading the chapter because then I know what I need to answer later on. And then we're off to step number 2, overview. How do I overview this material right here? Well, I'm going to read the heading right here. I'm going to read this heading right here. I'm going to read this heading right here. I'm going to read some of these bold-faced phrases here because they look like they might be important. I'm going to read anything that pops off the page is what you read during the overview step. So I'm looking at all the headings, all the subheadings, bold-faced words. And again, if you don't have headings, subheadings, bold-faced words, well, just read the first sentence of each and every single paragraph. Reading all these headings and subheadings doesn't take you a long time. For a lot of you, this is going to take you less than a minute to do this overview step. Now, if you have a textbook, it might take a little longer because you might have a 50-page chapter you got to get through. But it's still a matter of just kind of paging through the content, looking at the headings and subheadings. And you know why else this is useful? Because you want to get an idea, how long is this material that I'm about to read? You ever have that situation where you read a page, you've been reading for a long time, and you're reading through the chapter, you have no clue where you are, and you start getting to the end of a page, and as you're turning it, you're really hoping it's the last page in the chapter, and then it's not. It's just disappointing that you have to keep on going. Well, you want to get rid of that anxiety and find out how long is your material, and you could do this very easily during the preview and overview because you're paging through and selectively reading things. Now, assuming I read the first and last paragraph of this article here, and assuming I've read the headings and the subheadings, when I get to step number 3, actually, I'll tell you, before I get to step number 3 here, I make a decision. After these first 2 steps, I make a decision. Do I actually want to read this entire article? Or do I already know what it's about? Maybe I have enough information and I don't need to read it. Keep in mind, that's something that you have to actually ask yourself, because you can make good use of your time and prioritize your reading this way. Now, assuming that I do need to read this, maybe I have a test on this, I'm going to read it, but what's going to happen to my speed? Again, I'm going to fly through this material because I know what to expect. It's going to be very easy to get through it. Comprehension is going to be pretty good because I know what to expect. And retention, because I've got all this repetition going on, very easy to retain the material. And you're more likely to remember this information than someone that just read it once, beginning to end. Why? How many repetitions is that? That's one. And we know the way that we remember things, repetition helps us remember things. Another way you could remember things is to talk about what you just read. Or if you can explain the topic to somebody else, try to teach somebody what you just learned, that is another way that you can really remember the material better. So keep in mind, anytime you're reciting the material, think about this. How do actors and actresses remember their lines? They recite the material if they need to remember verbatim. Now, most students and most professionals, when they're reading, an article like this, you don't have to remember it word for word. If you did need to remember this word for word, it takes a lot of work, but you're going to have to recite it word for word. And that helps. But actors, they'll read the words out loud, they'll record themselves, they'll listen to themselves, and all of that repetition helps them remember. But if you don't need to remember it verbatim, chances are you probably don't, unless you're in the acting business. If you need to just remember the topics and the concepts and the details, well, it's a good idea to talk about what you just read, because that is the simplest way you could start getting it stuck in your head. I know that whenever I read something very fascinating, when I'm talking to somebody about it, I feel like I'm learning it a second time just by talking about it. And then you also find your weaknesses. Sometimes you're trying to explain something to someone, and you feel like if you feel like you can't explain it well, you might not know it that well, and it might be a good idea to maybe reread certain parts of the chapter. So keep in mind, it's all about repetition when we're trying to remember things. Talking about the material, taking notes, doing a multiple step process like this. These are all ways that we can actually improve our ability to remember the material. Now, there are some other ways that you can remember things. A lot of us have heard of mnemonic devices. Yes, mnemonic devices are simply they're they're kind of like hooks that will go into our brain and pull information out. So, this is a mnemonic device on your screen for the sequence and the colors of the rainbow. So all you have to remember is the name Roy G. Biv. And if you remember Roy G. Biv, each letter stands for one of the colors. And that's one way you could remember the sequence and the colors of the rainbow. Now, there are all sorts of mnemonic devices we've been told. Here's one for music. A lot of you are probably familiar with this one if you've ever taken a music class. Every good boy deserves fudge, or I remember learning it as every good boy does fine, or the word face. To help us remember the notes. What about the days of the month? There's a mnemonic device for remembering the days, how many days there are in a month. So you just look at your knuckles. And January is on the left, that's a knuckle, so it's 31 days. February is obviously 28 days or 29. March is a knuckle, that's 31. April, before you get to the next knuckle, you have this little valley. So April, that means 30. May, that's 31, and so on and so forth. Who created these mnemonic devices? I don't know, but they're pretty clever, and you can use them to your advantage. Now, some people will say, well, that's great. How do I, I have this chapter I just read, and how do I find a mnemonic device for this thing I'm going to be tested on? Well, there's all sorts of mnemonic devices out there. There are thousands of them out there. And one way that you can take advantage of the collective wisdom of the internet is to just do a Google search for mnemonic device and whatever topic you're trying to learn. So I've had nursing students that will search mnemonic device, and let's say they have to remember the systems of the body, and they'll search mnemonic device systems of the body, and somebody's written a blog post on it, or you find it in the most strange places of the internet where somebody has probably had to wrestle with this problem that you're dealing with. And if you're studying, law, medicine, anything, in the sciences, or maybe something in business, if you're looking for a mnemonic device, definitely try to seek it out on the internet. Now, I want to talk about another way we can remember more of what we read and how you can train yourself to remember more of what you read. Because when we do our speed reading courses, there's no tip you can tell someone that will just automatically make them read 2, 3, 4, 5 times faster. What happens is it takes practice, and there's a variety of drills and exercises to improve your reading speed, but you got to practice them. Well, it turns out, and by the way, if you're interested in that, if you haven't taken one of our speed reading courses, go on the website, check it out. There's a lot of drills and exercises. That's what we focus on, and that's how you get better at something, not by just, whispering a tip in somebody's ear. There's also exercises for improving your retention. I want to discuss one right now that you can practice on your own. An exercise to improve your retention. There's this exercise called the read and recall exercise. The read and recall exercise is something that I recommend you try out for 15 minutes a day for a couple weeks. And this is a good way to start improving your retention. Let me explain how the read and recall exercise works. Simply read a paragraph, and the moment you're done reading the paragraph, you will take a quick note about what that paragraph was about. When I say a quick note, I mean a keyword or a phrase. You don't have to write down, this paragraph was about blah, 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 blah. You don't have to write down full sentences. And then you just simply rinse and repeat. You read another paragraph, take a quick note. So imagine doing this over and over again. I know it sounds repetitive, but guess what? Repetition is the mother of skill. That's how we get better at anything. If you've ever practiced a sport or an instrument, you know this. Well, it turns out with recall, you can improve your retention by reading a paragraph and writing something down real quickly off the top of your head. This trains you to start getting better and constantly asking yourself, what did I just read? What did I just read? What did I just read? Now, you don't have to do this indefinitely for the rest of your life. But 15 minutes a day for 2 weeks, you'll find yourself being better able to retain information, because this is an exercise. It's a form of practice. It helps you get better at your reading recall. Now, if you're interested in the topic of memory, we talked a lot about remembering more of what you read. We talked about notes, the multiple reading process, the read and recall exercise, talking about what you just read. These are all little ways that you can improve your memory. If you're interested in improving your memory further, we actually have an online memory course that has 10 class videos. It's got over 7 hours of content. And these videos, you can download them. You can watch them online. Go on our website, check it out. If you go to irisreading.com and just click on online courses, you can see all of our online courses, but the memory course in particular, there's a number of really cool memory tricks. If you're trying to remember people's names, if you're trying to remember maybe a list of items, or if you're trying to remember a presentation. Of course, we also talk in more depth on how to remember more of what you read. We actually have a special going on the website where you could get these online courses for a discount. The special is available through the end of the week. So check that out when you get a chance, and also check out some of our other online courses on speed reading. We have a comprehension course. We've got a course on productivity. We do these courses online and in person. If you wanted to invite us to your school or your company or your organization, we'd be happy to do a workshop in person. We do them in a variety of formats: 1 hour sessions, 90-minute, 3 hour, 6 hour. We've done programs that are 12 hours, not all in one day, but over the course of a few days. But if you wanted to invite us, feel free to contact support@irisreading.com, or you can reach out to me directly. My email is pnowak@irisreading. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter, I want to thank you all for attending this webinar. If you like what we're doing over here at Iris, I hope you tell your friends about us. And if you don't like what we're doing, please tell your enemies about us. Thank you all for joining, and have a great day.